Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take complex source material and, well, really boil it down to what you need to know, and fast. Today it's a big one, an absolutely vital study shortcut, actually.
Yeah.
We're diving into those complex accessory organs of the GI tract, the liver, gallbladder, and the exocrine pancreas.
That's right. These are, metabolic powerhouses. And our mission today is really to explore what happens when things go wrong, when their function breaks down.
Okay.
We're structuring it, moving from the liver's basic jobs, synthesis, to its failures and excretion, things like jaundice, toxicity. Then we'll look at the gallbladder and pancreas disorders, always focusing on the how and the clinical results.
Great. Let's start with the big one then, the liver. Largest visceral organ, right? About 1.3 kilos.
Yeah.
And structurally, what always gets me is that unique double blood supply. It's like the body's ultimate checkpoint.
It absolutely is. I mean, 25% is your standard high oxygen arterial blood from the hepatic artery, but the really critical part is that 75% coming via the hepatic portal vein.
Low oxygen, though, right?
Low oxygen, yeah, but it's carrying everything just absorbed from the gut, the pancreas, the spleen. So nutrients, yes, but also any toxins, bacteria, straight to the liver before it can get anywhere else.
Okay. And that positioning explains those functional units, the lobules, being lined with those Kupffer cells. They're crucial.
Oh, absolutely crucial. They're the liver's resident macrophages, part of the reticuloendothelial system. They line the sinusoids, those small blood vessels in the lobules, and their job is basically nonstop filtering.
Filtering what, exactly?
They phagocytize, engulf bacteria, foreign stuff, even old, worn-out blood cells coming from that portal vein blood. It's cleanup crew number one, making sure the rest of the body isn't flooded with debris from the GI tract.
Right. Makes sense. So let's talk core functions, metabolic jobs. If any of these fail, it sounds like systemic crisis isn't far behind.
Yeah.
Like carbohydrate metabolism.
Yeah, the liver is key for glucose homeostasis. It stores glucose as glycogen, that's glycogenesis, and it can make new glucose from other sources when needed, gluconeogenesis.
So if that's impaired.
You can quickly get hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, or sometimes it's more subtle, like just abnormal glucose tolerance showing up on tests. But honestly, the protein metabolism functions, that's where failure gets catastrophic fast.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. We have to emphasize the proteins it makes, like albumin that's huge for plasma osmotic pressure, keeping fluid in the vessels.
Yeah.
And it binds loads of things for transport.
And don't forget the clotting factors. So many essential ones. Prothrombin, fibrinogen, factors V, 7, IX, X. If the liver isn't making those.
You bleeding problems.
Yeah.
Major edema from low albumin, too.
Exactly. And maybe even more critical, just for moment-to-moment survival, is the urea cycle. The liver takes ammonia, which is constantly produced from protein breakdown and is highly toxic, especially to the brain,
Right.
and converts it into harmless urea, which the kidneys can then easily excrete. Failure there isn't just a liver problem, it's immediate neurotoxicity.
Which circles back to why confusion, disorientation, that hepatic encephalopathy we hear about, is often such a dramatic sign when the liver really starts to fail later on. It starts right here with ammonia buildup.
Precisely. That connection is key. And just quickly, lipid metabolism, the liver synthesizes cholesterol, phospholipids, lipoproteins. It also makes ketones from fatty acids, which are a vital backup energy source, especially during fasting or starvation.
Okay, so we've covered synthesis and filtering. Let's shift to the liver's other big job, excretion. Bile production. How much are we talking?
Around 500 to 600 milliliters a day. And bile is absolutely essential for emulsifying dietary fats, breaking them down, and for absorbing fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K.
And when that bile flow slows down or stops?
That's cholestasis. It can be intrahepatic, meaning the problems within the liver cells or tiny bile ducts, or extrahepatic and obstruction in the larger ducts outside the liver. Either way, bile components back up.
Components like?
Bilirubin, cholesterol, bile acids, they accumulate in the blood instead of being excreted.
And what does that look like clinically? You mentioned itching with cholestasis.
Yeah, that intense itching, pruritus, is thought to be directly linked to those excess bile acids building up in the skin and blood. You might also see skin xanthomas, little fatty deposits under the skin from the impaired cholesterol excretion.
Okay. Now let's walk through the pathway to jaundice, or icterus, that yellowing. How does bilirubin processing lead to that?
Okay, step by step. It starts with the breakdown of old red blood cells. Heme from hemoglobin is converted into free bilirubin, also called unconjugated. This form is lipid-soluble, not water-soluble, so it has to bind to albumin to travel in the blood.
Got it. Bound to albumin.
Then it reaches the liver cell, the hepatocyte. Inside, it gets chemically conjugated, usually with glucuronic acid. This makes it conjugated bilirubin, which is water-soluble.
And that's the form that can be excreted.
Exactly. This soluble conjugated form is actively secreted into the bile, flows through the ducts, and eventually leaves the body in feces, giving stool its color.
So jaundice, the yellow color, appears when serum bilirubin gets above, what, 2.5 milli-GDL, and you often see it first in the eyes.
That's right. The sclera, the whites of the eyes. Bilirubin seems to have a particular affinity for elastic tissue, which is abundant there. That's often the first clue.
And figuring out why someone is yellow involves categorizing the jaundice, doesn't it?
Yes. Prehepatic means before the liver, too much bilirubin is being produced, usually from excessive red blood cell destruction, hemolysis. Intrahepatic means the problem is in the liver. The hepatocytes are damaged, maybe by hepatitis or cirrhosis, and they can't take up or conjugate the bilirubin properly.
Okay.
And posthepatic jaundice means the problem is after the liver, there's an obstruction blocking bile flow out, like a gallstone lodged in the common bile duct.
And we use liver enzymes in the blood to help pinpoint this, like ALT and AST.
We do. ALT, alanine aminotransferase, is considered more specific to the liver itself. So high ALT suggests hepatocyte inflammation or damage. AST is less specific. But if you see high alkaline phosphatase and GGT, that usually points more towards a problem in the biliary ducts, suggesting cholestasis or obstruction.
Right. Okay. And we can't discuss liver function without touching on drug and toxin metabolism, the detoxification role.
Absolutely. It's usually a multi-phase process. Phase 1 often involves chemical modification, using that famous CYP P-450 enzyme system. Then phase 2 is typically conjugation adding another molecule, often glutathione, to make the substance water-soluble so the kidneys or bile can eliminate it.
And this is where acetaminophen toxicity comes in, right? The phase 2 problem.
It is. With a normal dose, acetaminophen is safely conjugated, mainly using glutathione. But in an overdose, that glutathione pathway gets completely overwhelmed. Its capacity is exceeded.
So the drug isn't detoxified.
A toxic intermediate metabolite builds up instead, and that directly damages and kills liver cells, causing acute liver failure. And it's much, much worse in people who, say, chronically abuse alcohol because their glutathione stores are often already depleted. They have less defense to start with.
Wow. That's a critical interaction. Okay, that leads us nicely into specific liver diseases. Let's start with viral hepatitis, the different types. The key thing for learners is often the risk of it becoming chronic, isn't it?
Definitely. We can group them by how they spread and their long-term potential. Hepatitis A, HAV, and hepatitis E, HEV, are typically spread fecal orally contaminated food or water. They cause acute illness, usually self-limiting. Crucially, they don't cause chronic liver disease or a carrier state. HEV can be serious in pregnant women, though.
Okay, so A and E are acute. What about the others?
The ones to really worry about long-term are hepatitis B, HBV, hepatitis C, HCV, and hepatitis D, HDV. These are spread primarily through blood and sexual contact. They all have the potential to cause chronic infection.
And chronic infection means risk of
Cirrhosis, liver failure, and hepatocellular carcinoma liver cancer. That's the major danger.
You hear a lot about HCV being particularly problematic. Why is that?
Well, HCV is an RNA virus, and it's genetically very unstable. It mutates constantly. That makes developing an effective vaccine incredibly difficult. It's actually the leading cause for liver transplants worldwide right now.
And HDV, hepatitis D.
HDV is interesting. It's an incomplete virus. It basically needs HBV to survive. It can only replicate if the person is also infected with HBV, specifically needing the hepatitis B surface antigen, HBsAg. So you get it either as a co-infection with acute HBV or as a superinfection in someone who already has chronic HBV.
Got it. Okay, let's shift from viruses to toxins, specifically alcohol. How does alcohol actually damage the liver?
It's multi-pronged damage. First, the main way alcohol is metabolized generates acetaldehyde, which is directly toxic to hepatocytes. It also produces excess NADH, which disrupts other crucial metabolic pathways like glucose and lipid metabolism. Then there's a secondary pathway, the MEO system using CYP P-450 enzymes that gets ramped up with chronic drinking. That process generates reactive oxygen species, free radicals, which cause oxidative stress and further damage. It also makes the liver more susceptible to injury from other toxins like acetaminophen.
And this damage happens in stages.
Typically, yes. First is fatty liver, or steatosis. Fat accumulates in the liver cells. This stage is generally reversible if the person stops drinking.
Okay.
If drinking continues, it can progress to alcoholic hepatitis, which involves inflammation, necrosis, cell death, and early fibrosis. Symptoms often appear here. And the final stage is cirrhosis, extensive, irreversible scarring and fibrosis, nodule formation, disruption of blood flow. That's end-stage liver disease.
And we have to mention the non-alcoholic version too, right? NAFLD.
Absolutely. NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, is now the most common chronic liver disorder in developed countries. It's strongly linked to metabolic syndrome, obesity, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance.
And it follows a similar path.
It does. It starts with simple steatosis, fatty liver, can progress to NASH-MA, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which includes inflammation and damage, and then potentially onto cirrhosis and its complications, just like alcohol-induced disease.
So cirrhosis, whether from alcohol, NAFLD, or viruses, is the setting for that really dangerous complication. Portal hypertension. Explain that.
Portal hypertension is simply increased pressure within the portal venous system. The cirrhotic liver, with all its scar tissue and nodules, resists blood flow coming from the portal vein, so pressure backs up.
Like a dam forming.
Exactly. And that backup has three major consequences we need to understand.
Okay, what's the first?
Ascites. That's the accumulation of fluid, sometimes of vast amounts, 15 liters or more, in the peritoneal cavity, the belly. It's driven by that high portal pressure pushing fluid out of the capillaries, and also by the low albumin levels seen in liver failure, which reduces the force holding fluid in the vessels.
Right. Number two.
Splenomegaly. The spleen enlarges because blood backs up into it from the portal system. This leads to hypersplenism, where the enlarged spleen becomes overactive, trapping and destroying blood cells, red cells, white cells, and platelets. So patients often develop anemia, leukopenia, and especially thrombocytopenia, low platelets.
Increased bleeding risk again.
And the third, often most immediately life-threatening consequence, is the formation of portosystemic shunts.
Shunts. Like bypasses.
Exactly. The body tries to find alternative routes for blood to get from the portal system back to the general circulation, bypassing the blocked liver. Collateral veins develop. The most clinically important are esophageal varices.
Why are they so dangerous?
These are dilated, thin-walled veins in the esophagus. Because they're under high pressure from the portal backup and have thin walls, they are incredibly prone to rupture. And when they rupture, it causes massive, often fatal, hemorrhage. It's a medical emergency. You might also see caput medusae, which are dilated veins visible around the umbilicus, another sign of these shunts.
Yeah, that really highlights the severe consequences. Now, connecting back, you mentioned earlier the liver's amazing reserve.
Yes, this is so important. The sources emphasize that you generally need to lose 80 to 90%, 80 to 90 of hepatic functional capacity before you see signs of true liver failure.
That's incredible. It compensates for so long. So when failure finally hits, when that reserve is gone, what are the telltale signs?
You start seeing the results of both failed synthesis and failed detoxification. There's feta hepaticus, that characteristic musty, slightly sweet breath odor thought to be from metabolic byproducts. Endocrine changes happen because the liver can't metabolize steroid hormones properly. Things like gynecomastia, breast development in men, menstrual irregularities in women. Hematologic problems worsen bleeding tendency due to lack of clotting factors and poor vitamin K absorption. And then centrally, there's hepatic encephalopathy.
The brain effects again. You mentioned confusion earlier. Is there a physical sign?
The classic physical sign, especially in earlier stages, is asterixis. It's often called a flapping tremor. If you ask the patient to hold their arms out and dorsiflex their wrists, their hands will involuntarily flap back and forth.
And that's caused by?
Primarily by the accumulation of neurotoxins that the failing liver can no longer clear, with ammonia being the chief culprit. That's why treatments often aim to reduce ammonia production in the gut, using things like lactulose, which traps ammonia in the stool.
Right. Makes sense. And just briefly, liver cancer.
Two main primary types. Hepatocellular carcinoma, HCC, is the most common, strongly linked to chronic HBV and HCV infections, and also aflatoxin exposure. Cholangiocarcinoma is cancer of the bile ducts themselves, often associated with chronic biliary inflammation. But it's important to remember, in many parts of the world, metastatic cancer that spread to the liver from somewhere else is actually more common than primary liver cancer.
Okay, let's move downstream now to the gallbladder and the pancreas. Starting with the gallbladder, its main job is storing and concentrating bile, right?
Correct. And its main problem is cholelithiasis, gallstones.
What are they usually made of?
About 80% are primarily cholesterol stones. Formation really comes down to two main things. Abnormal bile composition, usually bile that's supersaturated with cholesterol and bile stasis, where the bile isn't moving properly and has time to precipitate.
Which explains the risk factors: female, older age, obesity.
Exactly. Those conditions are associated with higher cholesterol levels in bile or reduced gallbladder motility. And the classic symptom when a stone causes trouble, often by temporarily blocking the cystic duct, is biliary colic.
Describe that pain.
It's typically severe, steady pain in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen, often described as cramping or aching. It frequently radiates to the back, the right shoulder blade, or the shoulder tip, can last minutes to hours.
And if a stone gets stuck and causes inflammation?
Then you have acute cholecystitis, inflammation of the gallbladder wall, usually caused by obstruction of the cystic duct by a gallstone.
Okay. Now, the exocrine pancreas secretes digestive enzymes. What's the key safety feature?
The absolute key is that it secretes these powerful enzymes, trypsinogen, which becomes trypsin, amylase, lipases in an inactive form, proenzymes or zymogens. They only get activated once they reach the duodenum, preventing the pancreas from digesting itself. There are also trypsin inhibitors within the pancreas as a backup.
So, acute pancreatitis must be a failure of that safety mechanism.
Precisely. Acute pancreatitis is reversible inflammation caused by the inappropriate premature activation of these enzymes while they are still inside the pancreas. This leads to autodigestion. The pancreas starts digesting itself.
What triggers that premature activation?
The two leading causes by far are gallstones. A stone passing down the common bile duct can obstruct the pancreatic duct outlet, and alcohol abuse. Alcohol is thought to directly injure acinar cells and alter enzyme secretion.
And the main symptom?
The cardinal manifestation is severe, persistent abdominal pain, usually epigastric, upper central abdomen, that often radiates straight through to the back. It's often described as intense and boring. Severe cases can be life-threatening due to systemic inflammation and organ failure.
And if the damage isn't reversible? If it keeps happening?
Then you develop chronic pancreatitis. This involves irreversible destruction of pancreatic tissue and extensive fibrosis or scarring. The most common cause, overwhelmingly, is long-term, heavy alcohol abuse.
And the consequences of that permanent destruction?
As the pancreas fails, you lose both its functions. Destruction of the endocrine islets leads to diabetes mellitus. Destruction of the exocrine acinar cells leads to malabsorption syndrome because you can't digest food properly, especially fats. The classic sign of that is steatorrhea, bulky, fatty, foul-smelling stools.
Finally, a quick but important note on cancer of the pancreas.
Yeah.
The prognosis is notoriously poor.
It is grim. It's the fourth leading cause of cancer death in the U.S., largely because it's often diagnosed very late when it's already spread. The overall 5-year survival rate is sadly low, maybe 7–8%.
Adenocarcinoma is the most common type.
Yes, arising from the ductal cells. And location matters for symptoms. If the tumor is in the head of the pancreas, it often obstructs the common bile duct relatively early,
Causing jaundice.
Exactly. Painless jaundice can actually be the presenting symptom for tumors in the head of the pancreas. Tumors in the body or tail often present later with just pain and weight loss.
Wow. That was a dense, but incredibly important journey through the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. What really strikes me is how everything's connected: the metabolic roles, the filtration, the biliary system, the digestive enzymes. Failure in one spot, especially the liver, just ripples outwards with huge systemic effects.
It really does. And maybe the biggest takeaway, the concept that can be hardest to grasp clinically, is that vast functional reserve of the liver we talked about.
Right, that 80–90% loss before failure.
Exactly. It means diseases like cirrhosis or even hepatocellular cancer can smolder silently for years, doing massive damage, but the body compensates until it suddenly can't anymore. And then the presentation is often catastrophic. Understanding the difference between pre, intra, and post-hepatic jaundice is vital for diagnosis, yes, but understanding why liver disease presents so late because of that reserve is fundamental.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. Given that incredible functional silence, the fact the liver can hide so much damage for so long, what does that really imply for how we might approach early detection in the future? How do we screen effectively for subclinical damage when the body is, in a way, actively masking the problem until it's almost too late?
An important question indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into pathophysiology.
Keep learning, stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.